Imagine this. The year is 323 BC. In the ancient city of Babylon, the heat of summer clings to the walls of the palace. Behind the closed doors of a grand chamber, the most powerful man alive lies on his bed, his body burning with fever. He is only 32 years old, yet his name is already etched into history. Outside, thousands of soldiers wait in silence, their armor glinting in the sun, their faces filled with dread. Inside, his generals stand at his side, men who have marched with him across deserts, over mountains, through rivers of blood. They whisper, waiting for their king's final words. The man is Alexander, the one they call Great, and his story is unlike any other. Alexander's empire stretched farther than anyone could have imagined, from the rugged mountains of Greece to the sands of Egypt, from the palaces of Persia to the edge of India. His banner flew over cities and kingdoms that had once seemed untouchable. He had toppled kings, shattered empires, and marched his men to places no Greek had ever seen. And yet, in this moment, lying on his deathbed, a single question hung over the room. What will become of it all once he is gone? To understand the man who created such an empire, we must travel back to where it all began. The world of Alexander's birth was not one of peace. In the 4th century BC, Greece was a fractured land, carved into dozens of city-states. Athens, proud and cultured, had its philosophers and playwrights. Sparta, harsh and disciplined, had its warriors. Thebes, Corinth, and many others competed for influence, their rivalries as old as their walls. They spoke the same language, worshipped the same gods, but they fought one another as bitterly as they fought outsiders. And looming to the east was Persia, a vast empire that dwarfed Greece in size and wealth. To the Greeks, Persia was both a threat and a reminder that true power lay beyond their mountains, in the hands of kings who ruled millions. Macedonia, Alexander's homeland, sat on the northern edge of Greece. For much of its history, the southern Greeks sneered at it, calling its people half-barbarians. But in the mid-300s BC, a man rose who would change that. His name was Philip II, and he was Alexander's father. Philip was a visionary. When he became king, Macedonia was weak, poor, and politically fragile, yet in a few short years he transformed it into the most formidable military power in Greece. He reorganized the army, creating the Macedonian phalanx, a wall of tightly packed soldiers wielding spears far longer than those of their enemies. With this new weapon of war, he defeated army after army, and one by one, the proud Greek city-states fell under his control. By the time he was finished, Philip was master of Greece. His next ambition was greater still, to invade Persia and claim its empire for himself. But fate had other plans. In 336 BC, as Philip prepared his grand campaign, he was assassinated. Rumors swirled that jealous rivals, angry wives, or even foreign agents had plotted the deed. Whatever the truth, Philip's death left his kingdom in a dangerous position, and it left his 20-year-old son Alexander on the throne. Alexander was young, but he was no stranger to power. From the moment of his birth, he had been raised with a sense of destiny. His mother, Olympias, told him stories of divine blood. She claimed he was descended from Achilles, the greatest warrior of Greek legend. His father filled him with ambition, taking him on campaigns, showing him the art of war. And his tutor was none other than Aristotle, the philosopher whose words would echo through the ages. From Aristotle, Alexander learned not only philosophy and science, but also a vision of the world as a place waiting to be discovered, understood, and perhaps conquered. Even as a boy, Alexander was restless, filled with a burning energy. He grew up idolizing heroes like Achilles, not merely as figures from old tales, but as examples to follow. He didn't just read the Iliad, he carried it with him everywhere, sleeping with it beneath his pillow. For him, the world was not a place to simply live in, it was a stage upon which to achieve eternal glory. He also proved early that he was more than just a dreamer. At 16, while his father was away at war, Alexander was left to govern. When a nearby tribe rebelled, he didn't wait for his father to return. He raised an army, marched out, and crushed the revolt. At 18, he rode at the head of Macedonia's cavalry at the Battle of Chaeronea, where Philip defeated a coalition of Greek states. Alexander fought bravely, helping secure victory. By the time Philip died, his son had already shown both courage and skill in war. Still, when Alexander became king, many doubted him. He was young, he had enemies at home and abroad. Rivals whispered that he could not hold what his father had built. Rebellions broke out across Greece as cities sensed weakness. Neighboring tribes prepared to strike. To the east, Persia watched with interest, expecting the Macedonian kingdom to fracture. But Alexander did not falter. In his first months as king, he moved with speed and fury. He marched his army north, crushing rebellions before they could grow. He crossed into Greece itself, where the city of Thebes rose in defiance. Thebes was a proud state, the same city that had once humbled mighty Sparta. Many believed Alexander would show mercy. Instead, he unleashed his army. The walls were breached, the city burned, and thousands were killed or enslaved. The destruction of Thebes was brutal, but it sent a clear message. Alexander was not a boy king. He was a ruler who would not be challenged. The Greek city-states, terrified by the fate of Thebes, fell silent. One by one, they swore loyalty. In a single campaign, Alexander secured his father's empire. But this was only the beginning, for Alexander had no intention of simply holding what his father left behind. His father had dreamed of conquering Persia. Alexander was determined to do it, and more. In the spring of 334 BC, just 2 years after his father's death, Alexander marched east with an army of 40,000 men. It was a small force compared to the might of Persia, whose kings could summon hundreds of thousands. But Alexander carried with him something far greater than numbers: ambition, genius, and an unshakable belief that he was destined for greatness. The young king was about to begin a journey that would change the world forever. The spring of 334 BC brought with it a new chapter in history. The sun rose over the Hellespont, the narrow strait that separates Europe from Asia, and on its waters sailed the fleet of Alexander. For centuries, Greeks had spoken of Persia as a land of immeasurable wealth, an empire so vast it seemed endless. For Alexander, it was not just an enemy, it was destiny. As his army approached the strait, he paused. Stepping ashore on the Asian side, he threw a spear into the soil. "From this land," he is said to have declared, "I claim Asia, won by the spear." To his men, it was a bold gesture. To Alexander, it was more than symbolism. It was a promise that he had come not just to fight Persia, but to conquer it. His army numbered only around 40,000, 30,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, drawn from Macedonia, Greece, and allied states. Against the millions that Persia could command, this force looked tiny. But Alexander had two things that would carry him farther than numbers ever could. He had the discipline and innovation of the Macedonian army, sharpened by years of his father's reforms. And he had his own genius, a mind that could see the battlefield not as chaos, but as opportunity. The Persians were waiting. At the river Granicus, not far from the coast of modern Turkey, sat a Persian army. It was the first true test of Alexander's campaign. The Persians outnumbered him, their cavalry massed along the riverbanks, their infantry arrayed behind them. Many expected the young king to hesitate, to seek better ground. Instead, Alexander charged. The battle began with a daring assault across the river. Macedonian cavalry plunged into the current, their armor glinting, their horses thrashing in the water. The Persians rushed to meet them, their lances stabbing downward. For a moment, the outcome hung in the balance. Then Alexander himself entered the fray. Riding at the head of his companions, his elite cavalry, he cut into the Persian line with relentless fury. In the chaos, he fought hand to hand, his spear shattering against the armor of his enemies. According to legend, a Persian noble swung his sword down at Alexander's head, only for the young king's helmet to deflect the blow, leaving him dazed but alive. Another strike nearly ended him, but his companions rushed to his aid, cutting down the attackers. Moments later, Alexander rallied and drove forward, his presence turning the tide. The Persians broke, their cavalry scattered, their infantry fled, and the river ran red with blood. It was Alexander's first victory over Persia, and it sent shockwaves across the empire. The great king, Darius III, now knew that the Macedonian upstart was no mere nuisance. He was a storm sweeping eastward. With the coast of Asia Minor secured, Alexander moved swiftly. City after city opened its gates to him. Greek towns long under Persian rule saw him as a liberator, welcoming him with cheers and gifts. Yet not all were eager to submit. At Halicarnassus, the Persians and their Greek allies resisted fiercely. Alexander's army besieged the city, battering its walls with catapults and towers. The fighting was brutal, the defenders desperate, but in the end, the city fell. Each victory only fed Alexander's legend, convincing both his enemies and his own men that he was favored by the gods. But war was not just about conquest. It was also about image. Alexander knew the power of reputation. He spared some cities, showing mercy to those who surrendered. In others, he offered sacrifices to local gods, blending his presence with tradition. Step by step, he presented himself not only as a conqueror, but as a rightful ruler of the lands he entered. By 333 BC, Alexander's march had carried him deep into Asia. It was then that Darius himself finally took the field. The Persian king assembled an army far larger than Alexander's. Estimates range from 100,000 to over 200,000. Against them, Alexander commanded perhaps 40,000. The difference was staggering. Yet Alexander did not turn back. The two forces met near the town of Issus in what is now southern Turkey. The battlefield was narrow, hemmed in by mountains and the sea. A stroke of fortune for Alexander, since it prevented the Persians from using their numbers to full advantage. Darius positioned himself in the center of his line, surrounded by his elite guard, while his vast infantry stretched across the plain. When the clash came, it was thunderous. Macedonian phalanxes advanced, their spears leveled, while Persian soldiers swarmed forward. For hours the fighting raged, but Alexander, as always, sought the decisive blow. Leading his companions, he launched a cavalry charge straight at the heart of the Persian line, aiming directly for Darius himself. The impact was devastating. The Persian guard buckled under the assault. And then came the moment that would be remembered for centuries. Darius, seeing the enemy breaking through, lost his nerve. He abandoned his chariot and fled the battlefield. His massive army, seeing their king retreat, collapsed in panic. Tens of thousands were slaughtered, their bodies littering the field. Alexander had done the impossible. With a smaller force, he had shattered the full might of Persia's king. And more than that, he had captured Darius's family, his wife, his mother, his children. Alexander, in a rare gesture of respect, treated them with honor, ensuring their safety. To his men, it was proof of his magnanimity. To his enemies, it was a statement. Alexander was not just a warrior, he was a king. The victory at Issus transformed Alexander's campaign.
He was no longer a mere invader nibbling at the edges of the Persian world. He was now a conqueror who had humbled the great king himself. Cities surrendered before he reached their gates. Legends began to spread of a young man who could not be defeated, whose courage on the battlefield was matched only by his vision of empire. Yet Alexander was not content with victories alone. He turned south, toward the rich lands of the Levant in Egypt. At Tyre, a city perched on an island fortress, he faced one of his greatest challenges. The walls rose high above the sea, defying any attack. But Alexander was relentless. He ordered a causeway built from the mainland, stone by stone, stretching out into the water. For months, his men labored under constant assault, arrows raining down from the walls. Still they advanced, until finally siege towers reached the ramparts. In a storm of fire and steel, the Macedonians broke through. Tyre fell. The price was terrible. Thousands were slaughtered or enslaved, but the message was unmistakable. No wall, no fortress could withstand Alexander. When he marched into Egypt, the people welcomed him as a liberator. For centuries they had chafed under Persian rule. Now they embraced the young conqueror as their new pharaoh. At the mouth of the Nile, Alexander founded a city that would bear his name, Alexandria. It would become one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, a center of learning, trade, and culture for centuries to come. But Alexander's journey was far from over. Ahead lay the heart of Persia, the wealth of Babylon, the palaces of Persepolis, and battles yet to be fought against Darius himself. The boy who once slept with the Iliad beneath his pillow was now rewriting history in his own hand, carving his legend into the world with fire and steel. And the world had not yet seen the full measure of his ambition.
The victory at Issus was more than a triumph. It was a turning point. Alexander had shown the world that Persia's king could be defeated. Yet the empire was vast, and Darius still ruled over millions. If Alexander was to fulfill his ambition, he could not stop. He had to march deeper into Persia's heartland to claim the empire itself. In 331 BC, Alexander led his army across Mesopotamia, a land of rivers and fertile plains. Word spread of his advance, and everywhere people whispered of the young king who had humbled the great king. Yet Darius was not finished. Gathering another massive force, he prepared to meet Alexander once more, this time on a battlefield of his choosing. The place was Gaugamela, a wide plain near the city of Arbela. Darius assembled an army that dwarfed Alexander's, perhaps 200,000 strong, some say even more, drawn from every corner of the Persian Empire. He brought cavalry, infantry, archers, and even war elephants. His men leveled the ground to prepare for scythed chariots, deadly vehicles fitted with blades to cut through ranks of soldiers. Against them, Alexander commanded fewer than 50,000. The odds were staggering. As dawn broke on the day of battle, Alexander rode out in his gleaming armor, calm, fearless, his men's eyes fixed upon him. He spoke not of numbers, but of destiny. The Macedonians had marched too far to turn back. Victory here meant the empire of Persia itself. Defeat meant death. The clash began with thunder. The Persians hurled their chariots forward, blades whirling. But Alexander had prepared. His soldiers opened gaps in their lines, letting the chariots pass harmlessly through, then cut them down from behind. Next came the cavalry, waves of horsemen crashing against the Macedonian phalanx. The ground shook, dust filled the air, but the Macedonian lines held. And then Alexander saw his chance. On the Persian left, a gap opened. With a roar, he led his companions in a furious charge, a wedge of horsemen driving straight toward Darius in the center. The impact was devastating, piercing deep into the heart of the Persian formation. Once again, Darius faltered. Once again, he fled. His army, seeing their king abandon them, collapsed in panic. The slaughter was terrible. Tens of thousands lay dead on the plain, their cries lost in the chaos of retreat.
the Battle of Gaugamela sealed the fate of Persia. Darius fled eastward, but his empire was lost. Alexander marched into Babylon, the jewel of Mesopotamia. The city, rich and ancient, welcomed him as a conqueror. Gold, silver, and treasures beyond imagining fell into his hands. From Babylon, he moved to Susa, another royal city, where the Persian treasury yielded immense wealth. At last, he reached Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian kings. Persepolis was a wonder, a city of palaces, columns, and halls that seemed to touch the sky. Here, Alexander did something that would be remembered forever. One night, amid drunken revelry, the palace was set ablaze. Flames leapt into the night, devouring the wooden roofs, sending sparks high above the stone columns. Some say Alexander himself ordered the fire, a symbolic act to mark the end of Persia's power. Others claim it was a moment of recklessness, later regretted. Whatever the truth, Persepolis burned, its grandeur reduced to ash, a signal to the world that the old empire was dead. Yet Alexander's conquest was not complete. Darius still lived, fleeing eastward, gathering what forces he could. Alexander pursued him relentlessly, across deserts and mountains, never allowing his enemy peace. At last, in the summer of 330 BC, Darius was betrayed. His own satraps, seeing no hope of victory, seized him. When Alexander caught up, he found the Persian king dying, struck down by his own men.
Standing over Darius's body, Alexander mourned. Though he had hunted him for years, he now saw in him a fellow king, a man brought low by treachery. He ordered that Darius be buried with honor, as befit a great monarch. To Alexander's men, it was another sign of his strange blend of ruthlessness and respect, cruelty and mercy. To history, it marked the final fall of Persia. With Darius gone, Alexander was now the undisputed master of the largest empire the world had ever known. Greece, Egypt, Babylon, Persia, all were his. He could have stopped there, content to rule as the greatest conqueror in memory. But Alexander was not content. His ambition had no limits. The maps he carried still showed blank spaces, lands beyond the horizon. And to him, those were not voids, they were invitations. He began to adopt the trappings of Persian kingship. He wore their robes, sat upon their thrones, demanded rituals of submission from his subjects. To his Macedonian companions, this was unsettling. They had marched with him as comrades, soldiers of a Greek king. Now he seemed to be transforming into something else, a ruler not just of men, but of worlds. Whispers spread in the camp. Some said he was beginning to believe he was not merely human, but divine. Still, his army followed. Eastward they marched, across the Iranian plateau, into lands few Greeks had ever seen. In Bactria, in modern Afghanistan, he faced fierce resistance from mountain tribes. The fighting was brutal, the terrain unforgiving. Yet Alexander pressed on, building fortresses, marrying local princesses, weaving his empire together with both sword and diplomacy. It was during these years that Alexander met one of the few people who could truly match him in spirit, Roxana, a noblewoman of Bactria. Struck by her beauty and strength, he took her as his wife. Their marriage was more than love, it was also strategy, binding him to the lands he had conquered. Still, it showed a side of Alexander few had seen, a man who, amid endless war, could still be touched by affection. But even here, even after years of conquest, his eyes looked farther. Beyond the mountains lay India, a land of immense wealth, strange beasts and powerful kings. Stories reached him of elephants in war, of rivers wider than seas, of peoples who had never bowed to Persia, never known Greek. To Alexander, It was irresistible. And so the march continued. His men, hardened by years of battle, followed him once more into the unknown. They had conquered the greatest empire of their age. Now they would march beyond it, into lands where no Greek soldier had ever set foot, into the heart of a world that seemed without end. For Alexander, Persia was only the beginning. After years of relentless conquest, Alexander's gaze turned eastward. The lands beyond Persia were mysterious and vast, stretching into territories the Greeks barely imagined. His men had fought countless battles, crossed deserts where water was a treasure, and climbed mountains where the air itself seemed thin and harsh. Yet Alexander, unshaken, led them onward. His ambition did not allow rest. He wanted to reach the ends of the world and claim them as his own. The armies moved into the Indus Valley, a land rich and strange. Rivers thundered through plains, jungles hid unknown beasts, and the local kings ruled fiercely. One such king was Porus, a man as tall and imposing as the legends told. Porus commanded elephants trained for war, animals the Macedonians had never faced in battle. Each elephant carried towers of men armed with spears and bows, their sheer size enough to break lines of infantry. To the Macedonians, it seemed as if the very earth had risen against them. But Alexander did not hesitate. He studied the battlefield, noting the flow of the river Hydaspes, the positions of Porus's army, and the weaknesses in their formation. Then, as always, he struck with precision. Under cover of night and early morning mists, he led his troops across the swollen river, some wading through currents that reached their shoulders. The Persians and Indian allies on the opposite bank were caught off guard. Alexander's soldiers, disciplined and fearless, held their ground as the elephants charged. The clash was monumental. The elephants trampled men, sent horses rearing, and spread chaos through the Macedonian ranks. Yet Alexander adapted. Cavalry units split to avoid the elephants' paths, spearmen formed defensive walls, and archers targeted the mahouts, the elephant drivers. The battlefield became a storm of steel, tusks, and cries of men and beasts alike. At the critical moment, Alexander rode at the head of his companion cavalry, diving directly at Porus. The king, mounted on a massive elephant, met him with fierce courage. Spear met spear, horse against beast, and for hours the outcome hung uncertain. Then, as the Macedonians pressed their advantage, Porus's lines began to falter. His elephants panicked, soldiers fled, and finally, the king was captured. Alexander approached Porus with respect. When asked how he wished to be treated, Porus replied simply, "Like a king." Impressed by his bravery, Alexander allowed him to retain his kingdom as a vassal, a rare act of mercy in an era of conquest. It was a moment that revealed the duality of Alexander's character, a ruthless warrior in battle, yet a shrewd statesman, willing to turn enemies into allies. Despite the victory, the campaign took its toll. Alexander's men had marched farther than any Greek army had ever ventured, enduring heat, monsoon rains, and diseases unknown in Macedonia. Morale began to waver. At the banks of the river Beas, further east than anyone had gone before, the soldiers finally spoke. They were exhausted. They had fought countless battles, crossed deserts where water was a treasure, and climbed mountains where the air itself seemed thin and harsh. Yet Alexander, whose ambition often seemed limitless, could not force them onward without risking mutiny. It was a turning point. The young king had dreamed of reaching the eastern edge of the known world, of conquering lands that no Greek had set foot upon. But he was forced to relent. Turning his army back westward, he accepted the limits imposed by men and nature alike. Even for Alexander, some boundaries could not be overcome.
The march back was no less remarkable. Alexander continued to consolidate his empire, establishing cities along the route, leaving garrisons and spreading Greek culture. In every settlement, he encouraged trade, learning, and the mingling of peoples. Alexandria in Egypt had become a beacon of civilization, but similar cities emerged across Persia and the East, marking the blending of Greek and local traditions, a legacy that would endure for centuries. Yet the return journey was harsh. Alexander's army faced monsoon rains, treacherous rivers, and hostile tribes. Many soldiers died of illness and exhaustion. The young king himself endured the same hardships, riding alongside his men, sharing in their suffering. His companions marveled at his endurance. Even as whispers began to spread, some wondered if his ambition had pushed them too far, if the glory they sought was becoming a burden too heavy to bear. When Alexander finally reached the western side of India, he paused. His army, though battered, had grown stronger in spirit, hardened by hardship and bound together by the memory of impossible victories. Alexander's gaze turned south toward the Arabian Sea and west toward Persia, toward the lands he had already conquered. He was no longer just a Greek king or Macedonian prince. He had become a symbol, a man whose ambition had reshaped the world, whose name would echo through history, whose deeds would inspire poets, generals, and kings for centuries to come. Even in the quiet moments away from battle, Alexander's mind raced. He studied maps, dreamed of new campaigns, and contemplated the administration of his vast empire. He adopted Persian customs, married into local nobility, and sought to unify his conquered peoples under a common vision. His approach was unprecedented. Few conquerors had understood the power of blending cultures, of ruling not merely by force, but through respect and assimilation. Yet Alexander's story was not just one of military genius. It was also a story of ambition, courage, and the human spirit. He had pushed men and nations to their limits, reshaping the world in the process. But it was also a story of limits. The limits of human endurance, the limits of loyalty, and the limits of ambition itself. At the banks of the Bias River, Alexander confronted the realization that even the greatest general could not command the infinite. Even the son of a king, tutored by the greatest philosopher of the age, could not bend the world entirely to his will. It was a moment of reflection in a life defined by relentless action. Alexander had conquered Persia, toppled kings, founded cities, and created an empire unmatched in size and power. He had faced elephants in battle, rivers that seemed impassable, armies that outnumbered his own tenfold. Yet in the end, he learned that even the greatest among men must sometimes accept the limits imposed by those around him, by nature, and by the human spirit. As he turned his army westward, the young king carried with him not only the spoils of conquest, but the lessons of experience. He had seen the vastness of the world, the diversity of peoples, and the heights to which ambition could take a man. And though he would continue to push forward in the years to come, this journey into India remained a testament to both his genius and his humanity. A reminder that even Alexander the Great was, at times, bound by the very world he sought to command.
The return from India was not a triumphant parade. It was a grueling journey, a march through lands that tested every ounce of endurance in Alexander's men. Rivers swelled with monsoon rains, mountains rose like walls of stone, and desert winds cut like blades. Soldiers who had fought and survived countless battles now struggled against thirst, disease, and fatigue. Horses died, supplies ran low, and the men began to question whether their king's ambition had taken them too far. Alexander, ever resolute, rode at the front. His presence inspired his army, but even he could not shield them from the harsh realities of nature. At one point, the army was forced to cross the Gedrosian Desert, a barren stretch of sand and sun. Many perished in the heat, some collapsing to the ground, never to rise again. Yet Alexander pressed on, knowing that to stop would be to admit defeat, and he could not. Despite the hardships, the campaign solidified his reputation. Tales of his courage, clever tactics, and unyielding drive spread across the regions he had conquered. In the cities of Persia and the Levant, in Egypt, and even in Greece, people spoke of the young king who had marched farther than any man before him, who had faced elephants and armies many times his size, and who had emerged victorious every time. He was no longer merely a general. He was a legend in his own lifetime. Upon reaching Babylon, Alexander began the task of governing his vast empire. He reorganized the administration, appointing satraps, governors, to oversee the diverse lands under his control. He encouraged the fusion of Greek and local cultures, marrying Persian princesses to Macedonian generals, blending traditions to create a sense of unity. His vision was ambitious, not just conquest, but a lasting empire that could survive beyond his lifetime. Yet the pressures of ruling were immense. Even in Babylon, whispers of dissent and conspiracy reached him. Alexander, once a fearless warrior on the battlefield, grew increasingly paranoid. He had trusted generals and companions, men who had fought beside him since the earliest campaigns, yet rumors of betrayal were constant. In some cases, those he suspected were executed. In others, harsh punishments were meted out to suppress rebellion. The weight of empire and the drive to secure his legacy began to consume him. As he traveled between cities, Alexander also faced the challenge of his own mortality. He was no longer the young, untested warrior who had crossed the Hellespont at 20. His body carried the scars of countless battles, and illness began to take its toll. Yet he refused to rest. Even in sickness, he rode with his men, strategized over maps, and planned campaigns that many thought impossible. His ambition remained unbounded, his vision unshaken. In 323 BC, Alexander returned to Babylon after a campaign in the east. It was there, in the heart of the empire he had built, that his life came to an abrupt and mysterious end. Some say it was fever, perhaps malaria or typhoid. Others suggest poison, though evidence is scant. On the night of his death, Babylon mourned. Temples rang with bells, citizens wept in the streets, and soldiers who had followed him from Greece to India felt a profound emptiness. Alexander was only 32. He had achieved what no man before him had done: the conquest of the known world, the defeat of empires, and the establishment of cities that would endure for centuries. And yet, he had left no clear successor. His empire, immense and diverse, was suddenly without its master. Generals quarreled over territory. The lands he had conquered began to fracture, divided among those who had once been his closest companions. What he had built with blood and vision would not long survive intact, but his influence would echo across history in ways even he could not have imagined.
Even in death, Alexander inspired awe. Cities continued to bear his name, the most famous of them, Alexandria in Egypt, becoming a center of learning, culture, and trade. Scholars traveled from distant lands to study in the libraries he founded. Greek culture merged with Persian, Egyptian, and Indian traditions, creating a new civilization that scholars would later call Hellenistic. Art, science, philosophy, and commerce flourished in the empire he had forged, and his legend grew with each passing generation. Generals and kings in the centuries to come studied his tactics. Napoleon Bonaparte, centuries later, would admire the audacity of his campaigns. Military academies across the world analyzed his battles, from Granicus to Gaugamela, for lessons in strategy, leadership, and the use of terrain. Alexander's name became synonymous with brilliance in warfare, ambition beyond measure, and the relentless pursuit of destiny. But Alexander's story is also a story of the human spirit. He showed that vision and courage could reshape the world, that a single man with intellect, determination, and charisma could change the course of history. Yet his life also reminds us of limits, the limits of ambition, the fragility of empire, and the inevitable mortality that all humans face. He reached the edges of the known world, but he could not live long enough to see the full consequences of his conquests. In the centuries after his death, his empire splintered into regions ruled by his generals, the Diadochi, each carving out their own kingdoms. Egypt fell to Ptolemy, who would found a dynasty that lasted nearly 3 centuries. Persia was divided among Seleucus and his successors. Yet even as the political structures he built collapsed, the cultural and intellectual legacy he left behind endured. Greek language, art, architecture, and science spread throughout the lands he had conquered. Trade routes, some established by his campaigns, connected distant civilizations. Ideas traveled as far as the Mediterranean and India, creating a new era of exchange and learning. Alexander the Great's life, though brief, reshaped the world. He had marched farther than anyone had thought possible, fought battles that seemed unwinnable, and inspired loyalty and fear in equal measure. He had lived a life of extremes, courage and ambition, brilliance and ruthlessness, mercy and severity. He had been a conqueror of lands and a unifier of cultures, a king who dared to challenge the limits of his era. And as the sun set over Babylon, as his body was carried in state and his generals debated the future, one truth remained clear. No one in his lifetime had matched his vision, his daring, or his capacity to change the world. Alexander's name would echo through history, a symbol of what it means to strive for greatness, to reach beyond the possible, and to leave a mark on the world that time itself cannot erase.
Even centuries after his death, the name Alexander the Great resonated across the world. He became more than a man. He became a symbol, a standard of ambition, courage, and the relentless pursuit of greatness. Stories of his deeds spread far beyond the lands he had conquered, reaching Greece, Rome, India, and beyond. Each culture reshaped his legend, mixing history with myth, until Alexander was not just a king, but a hero, a demigod in the eyes of the people. His military genius became the subject of study for generations. The battles at Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, and the Hydaspes were analyzed not only for their strategy, but for the daring and innovation he displayed. He had shown that a smaller, disciplined army could defeat numerically superior forces, that mobility, intelligence, and leadership could outweigh brute numbers. Leaders and generals from Hannibal to Caesar to Napoleon would later cite his campaigns as models for tactical brilliance. Alexander's conquests also spread Greek culture in ways few could have imagined. The cities he founded became centers of Hellenistic civilization, where Greek language, art, philosophy, and science blended with local traditions. Alexandria in Egypt became a hub of learning, home to the great library and scholars who preserved and expanded knowledge that would influence the world for millennia. Across Persia, Mesopotamia, and even into India, Greek influence mingled with local traditions, creating a cultural fusion that reshaped the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Yet his story was not just about conquest and culture. It was about ambition, vision, and the human spirit. Alexander had dared to see the world differently, to imagine what no one else could imagine. He had pushed beyond the known, tested the limits of endurance, and challenged the conventional wisdom of what was possible. He inspired loyalty in his men, fear in his enemies, and awe in all who heard his story. Even the legends surrounding him reflected this duality. Tales grew of his divine ancestry, of his mother claiming he descended from Achilles, of his encounters with strange lands and beasts, of battles where he seemed invincible. Some said he spoke to the gods, that they guided him. Others whispered that his ambition led him to see himself as more than mortal, that he sought not only to conquer kingdoms, but to transcend humanity itself. Whether truth or myth, these stories captured the imagination of countless generations. But Alexander's life also carried lessons about the limits of power. He achieved more in 32 years than most could in a lifetime, yet he left no clear successor. His empire fractured almost immediately, divided among his generals who fought for control. It was a reminder that even the greatest man cannot make his vision eternal, that human ambition must always contend with mortality and circumstance. His empire, vast and unified under his hand, splintered quickly, yet the cultural and historical ripples continued. Through it all, Alexander's name endured. He became a standard by which all great leaders would be measured. Kings, generals, and scholars marveled at his audacity. Poets and historians wrote of his courage and cunning. He inspired countless works of art, literature, and philosophy. His life became a story that could be told and retold, a legend that transcended the centuries. Alexander the Great's legacy is not confined to maps or battles. It lives in the cities he founded, in the blending of cultures he encouraged, in the ideas he helped spread. It lives in the notion that one person, driven by vision and unrelenting ambition, can change the course of history. And it lives in our imagination, reminding us that greatness is possible, even in the brief span of a single life. In the end, Alexander's story is a testament to the extraordinary potential of human ambition. He was a conqueror, a visionary, a ruler, and a man who dared to dream beyond the horizon. His life shows us both the heights we can reach and the costs of striving for them. He reminds us that history is shaped not only by armies and battles, but by the courage and determination of those who refuse to accept limits. And so, even today, as we look back across the centuries, we see Alexander not only as a general, a king, or a conqueror, but as a symbol of the human drive to explore, to achieve, and to leave a mark that outlives the boundaries of time. His story endures, a legend of ambition, courage, and the relentless pursuit of the impossible, a life that changed the world forever.